Hello, my name is Robert Paul Wolff, and with this lecture I begin an extended series of lectures on the subject of ideological critique. Before I introduce you to the series of lectures, let me just say a word about the way in which I am presenting this lecture to you. I'm speaking to you from my study in my condominium apartment in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Across from me on my desk is a little camcorder that is recording me. It may look as though I am delivering a lecture, but I'm actually speaking to nobody at all. And I have to confess, I find this a little bit weird. I taught my first class just 60 years ago as a young teaching fellow in philosophy at Harvard. I taught my most recent class last semester at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Now, in all of that time, I sometimes lectured to students, 200 or more at a time. Sometimes I gave small seminars, but not once did I lecture to nobody at all. I came close once. Back in 1963, Sylvan Bromberger and I, when we were young assistant professors at the University of Chicago, decided to offer a seminar on the philosophy of history. Only 2 graduate students signed up. So each week for 2 hours, the 4 of us would gather at the end of a long seminar table and speak to each other very softly about the philosophy of history. That came close, but this is the first time I have ever spoken to nobody at all. So I hope you will forgive me if I find this a little bit awkward. As I say, the topic of these lectures is ideological critique. By ideological critique, I mean, speaking generally, the demonstration that a putatively value-neutral and objective description of the world actually conceals a thoroughly interested distortion of reality in the service of some social or economic group. Thus, ideological critique is a kind of unmasking, and as we will see as we go through these lectures, that has considerable significance for the power and the importance of ideological critique. These lectures are organized in 3 segments with a coda at the end. Each segment will run 2, 3, or maybe 4 lectures in length. I'll be delivering 1 each week. So starting now, which is to say at the beginning of the spring semester, I should be lecturing perhaps until the end of April. As I record each of these lectures, I will put them up on YouTube, where they can be seen, and I will also make notations on my blog to let those who come to my blog know that the lectures are there. In the first segment, which is what we will start with, I will be talking at some length about one of the great works of classic political sociology, this book here, Ideology and Utopia, by Karl Mannheim. Mannheim's theories of ideology and utopia will serve as the conceptual frame for everything else in the lectures. After we have talked at some length about ideology and utopia, I will launch into the first of 2 detailed and extended analyses of particular ideological critiques. The first of them will take us to the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. There, in the 1960s and 70s, a group of anthropologists led by the Canadian anthropologist Richard Lee spent a long time studying a group of people who were known variously as the Zhou or as the Kung. That strangled sound I just made is my unsuccessful effort to pronounce a word in what's called a click language, and the Zhou speak one of the click languages of southern Africa. But although we will talk some about Lee's work and the work of his associates, the real focus of our, by the way, this is the book the most important of the books that Lee and his associates produced, Kalahari Hunter-Gatherers. They actually produced several books, scores of journal articles, and even a 50-minute documentary. Their work was then the subject of a scathing ideological critique by an American anthropologist named Edwin Wilmson. In his book, Land Filled with Flies, which will be the real focus of this segment of the lectures, Wilmson mounts a devastating critique not only of the work of Lee and his associates, but actually of the entire discipline of ethnography itself. This will take us very deep into the weeds, and we'll be talking in great detail about these people, the Jew. But we will also be talking in a very complex theoretical way about Wilmson's Marxist interpretation of their lives and their history. When we're finished talking about Edwin Wilmson and Land Filled with Flies, we'll make a complete reversal, travel back to the United States, and we will take a look at a book by one of the best-known scholars of African American studies, Henry Louis Gates, Jr. His name may be familiar to you. He has for many years been the chair of the Afro-American Studies Department at Harvard University. Far and away, Gates's best book is this one, The Signifying Monkey. It is Gates's attempt to develop a literary critical theory of African American literature. And in doing so, he discusses in detail 3 novels by well-known African American authors, 2 of which I will be talking about. You probably know both of them. One of them is Zora Neale Hurston's classic work, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and the other is an even better known work by Alice Walker, The Color Purple. What we will discover is that Gates is not only presenting a theory of African American literary criticism, which he traces back to the oral traditions and the religions of West Africa and to the folk culture of the African American slaves, but he also mounts a really angry ideological critique of the discipline of literary criticism itself, as practiced by the high priests of that discipline, Jacques Derrida, Paul de Man, Jeffrey Hartman, Harold Bloom, and others. When we have finished with that segment of the lectures, I will be almost done, but one last lecture will touch on a subject which I have enjoyed and which actually was brought to my attention more by a movie than by a book. We will be taking a look at Jane Austen's famous novel, Mansfield Park, and the essay written about it by the scholar who virtually by himself created the discipline of post-colonial studies, Ed Said. Edward Said, I'm proud to say, was a colleague of mine at Columbia when I taught there in the 1960s. Said had a distinguished career at Columbia. He was a tireless advocate for the Palestinian people, and he was a critic of the imperial and Western-oriented understanding of the world that he called in one of his most famous books, Orientalism. In this book, Culture and Imperialism, which is a collection of essays by Said on European novels, he writes an essay about Mansfield Park in which, astonishingly, he claims that the novel is really about slavery. Now, we will talk about Mansfield Park, and indeed I hope that many of you have read it. If you have read it, I think you will agree that it doesn't seem to be about slavery at all. And nevertheless, Said insists that that is really what the subject of the book is, what the subtext is, as they say in the game. And I got interested in this when I saw a movie of Mansfield Park made by the Canadian director Patricia Rozema. She was clearly very deeply influenced by Said's interpretation of the novel and built into her movie certain things that are not in the book, which made explicit what Said said was implicit in the novel. I got interested in this and did a little research and discovered to my astonishment that there's a great deal of historical evidence to defend Said's interpretation. So we will end with a kind of Bafo lecture in which I undertake to demonstrate that, contrary to all impressions, Mansfield Park really is about slavery. All right, now let's get started. Let's start with, I'm going to flip all these books over, having shown them to you. By the way, I should tell you, these lectures are intended to be understood and enjoyed by those of you who are not doing any of the reading. The lectures stand on their own, but quite obviously there is a good deal more that can be got out of these lectures if you will read along with me, at least some of the works. If you want to get a list of them and some information about them, you can go to my blog. I don't have the technology to put a little URL at the bottom of my picture, but if you will Google my name, Robert Paul Wolff, remembering to spell the last name with 2 F's, up will pop on the first or second hit my blog, The Philosopher's Stone. And if you go to that blog, you will find there a link to a storage facility called box.net, where you can find a list of all these books and perhaps some other information that will help you to follow along with the lectures. And of course, you're invited, if you have questions about the lectures, simply to send me an email. My email address is on my blog, or to make a comment on the blog and I will respond. I would like to think that I'm talking to somebody, not just to a camera. At any rate, let's start with Karl Mannheim. Mannheim was born in Budapest in 1893, and after growing up there and being educated there, he moved to Germany, where he spent a good many years lecturing until 1933. And then, when the Nazis came to power, he fled to London and spent the rest of his life teaching at the London School of Economics, dying there in London in 1947. 1893 to 1947. That life is significant in many ways for his work. He was born during that long century of peace in Europe between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of the First World War, and grew up in that world. He lived through the First World War, he lived through the Depression, he lived through the rise of Nazism, he lived through the Second World War, and that was the context of his intellectual work. And of course, during that time, he saw enormous changes in Europe and in the intellectual world of which he was a part. He actually published Ideology and Utopia in its original German edition in 1929, when he was in Germany. Then, when he was in England, in 1936, he brought out a new English version of the book, which had a long additional introductory chapter. And it is that version of the text that I'll be talking about, since a good deal of what I have to say is based on that, or at least in the first several lectures, is based on that first chapter. Mannheim intends his book as a contribution to a new discipline, the sociology of knowledge. Now, we're all familiar with the different branches of sociology. There's the sociology of religion, the sociology of the family, the sociology of work, the sociology of bureaucratic institutions, the sociology of education, the sociology of the military. But what is sociology of knowledge? You might at first think that what he meant was the sociology of science, you know, the sort of thing. Science used to be done by individual investigators alone in their laboratories. Now it's done by large numbers of people working together cooperatively and publishing articles with 5, 6, 7, or 8 names on them. But that's not the sort of thing that Mannheim has in mind at all. Instead, he says something quite different. He says, this book, this is the opening paragraph of the book, he says, this book is concerned with the problem of how men actually think. The aim of these studies is to investigate not how thinking appears in textbooks on logic, but how it really functions in public life and in politics as an instrument of collective action. That's on page 1 of the book. The very next page, Mannheim enunciates what he says is his fundamental thesis. Here's what he says. The principal thesis of this sociology, of the sociology of knowledge, is that there are modes of thought which cannot be adequately understood as long as their social origins are obscured. There are modes of knowledge that cannot be understood so long as their social origins are obscured. What could he possibly mean by that? He doesn't mean that we can't tell why people believe certain things without knowing their social origins. That's not what he means at all. And he doesn't mean that in order to understand where certain modes of knowledge come from, we have to look back at how they were developed. He quite literally means that there are modes of knowledge that we cannot understand unless we know their social origins. Now, you might think if you're a native speaker of English or German or any other natural language, you can understand the sentences that are uttered in that language. You might not know about them. They might involve technical matters that you are unfamiliar with, but you can understand what they mean. You can understand the language. And Mannheim says, no. There are modes of knowledge, modes of thought, which cannot be adequately understood as long as their social origins are obscured. What does he mean by that? Well, I could try to give you a theoretical answer. I could talk about reification and objectification and false consciousness and inversion. I could use the word dialectical a lot. But I'm afraid that that would simply be a matter of trying to explain the puzzling by the incomprehensible, which reminds me, I must confess, of the famous remark by Oscar Wilde that an English fox hunt was the unspeakable in pursuit of the inedible. At any rate, instead of giving you a theoretical explanation of Mannheim's central claim, I'm going to tell you a story. I was born in 1933 in the borough of Queens in New York City. In 1940, my parents bought a tiny row house further to the east in Queens, in the newly developed housing development called Kew Gardens Hills. And that's where I lived until I was 16 and went off to college. 3 or 4 years later, when I was about 9 or 10, I got it into my head that I wanted to learn to play the violin. There was nothing particularly unusual about that. In those days, every little Jewish boy in Queens wanted to play the violin. Well, my parents talked to their friend Joe Wieland, who played viola in the New York Philharmonic under the direction of Arturo Toscanini. And Joe said that in Manhattan, on 71st and Broadway, there was a woman named Irma Zacharias who was a really good violin teacher. So it was arranged that I would take violin lessons with Irma Zacharias. But even though New York in those days was a friendly and welcoming place, my parents were a little bit nervous about sending a 10-year-old boy all by himself into Manhattan to take violin lessons. Fortunately, down at the end of the block, Harry and Sylvia Rosenberg had a teenage daughter named Beverly who was taking piano lessons from Mrs. Zacharias' daughter Dorothea. So it was arranged that her piano lesson and my violin lesson would take place at the same time. And each week, Beverly took me into Manhattan for my violin lesson while she had her piano lesson. Well, it was wartime, and the city hadn't gotten around to bringing bus service all the way out to Kew Gardens Hills yet. So we had to walk the mile or so from our home to the Union Turnpike subway station so we could go into Manhattan. And since Beverly was a well-brought-up young lady, while we walked the mile, she undertook to teach me the elements of polite behavior. A gentleman rises when a lady walks into the room. A gentleman holds the door open for a lady. And most important of all, when a gentleman and lady are walking along on a sidewalk, the gentleman walks on the outside and the lady walks on the inside. I didn't think to ask why. When you're 10 years old, you learn a lot of stuff without asking why. And if I had asked Beverly, she wouldn't have had any clue why. That was just the way gentlemen behaved and the way ladies behaved. If we had asked Harry and Sylvia Rosenberg, they wouldn't have had a clue either. Indeed, if I had asked my parents, they wouldn't have known, even though my father was an educated man. He had graduated from City College and he was a high school teacher. In order really to find out why gentlemen rise when a lady walks in the room and why they walk on the outside with the lady on the inside, you would have had to consult an historian of medieval Europe. And that historian could have told you that in the 11th century or so, there developed something called courtly love, which in the courts of the Dukes of Aquitaine and Provence and Burgundy and in the Kingdom of Naples, lords and ladies developed this fantasy that they were living the lives of King Arthur's knights of the Round Table, or of the Merovingian princes like Roland in the Chanson de Roland. And they made a big deal about going on quests and carrying a scarf from your lady and protecting her and so forth. It was, among other things, an amusement. The minstrels of the day sang ballads about courtly love. It was also a way of justifying their power and their wealth and their authority over the serfs and the peasants who did the work that made the food and clothing that they wore and that they ate. Well, centuries went on, and these practices were continued long after the original ideal of courtly love had somewhat dwindled. You can see what happened to it if you take a look at Don Quixote and things of that sort, by Cervantes and things of that sort. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the merchants and the skilled craftspeople living in the walled cities, the bourgs as they were called in France, hence bourgeois, took on these practices as a way of imitating the lords and ladies and jumping themselves up to be quasi-aristocrats. By the 16th and 17th century, or 17th and 18th centuries, the kings of France, who were always desperate for money for their endless wars, were selling patents of nobility to wealthy merchants, documents which claimed to show that somewhere in the history of the family of this merchant there was an aristocrat, which justified this merchant in putting on robes and calling himself a member of the noblesse de la robe, or noblesse de robe. The noblesse d'épée were the real aristocrats who were allowed to carry swords. By the 19th century, it was English businessmen who in one century had gone from being apprentices to being wealthy merchants and manufacturers, who were imitating these long-held and partly forgotten practices as a way of claiming that they were better than their workers, better than the peasants, better than those below them, and worthy of being welcomed into polite society. And so it was that in the middle of the 20th century, little Robbie Wolff was taught by Beverly Rosenberg that a gentleman walks on the outside and the lady walks on the inside when you're walking on a pavement. All of that would be necessary in order to understand something that, when it was taught to me, was just one of those things that a boy learns that he's supposed to do. Something like that is what Mannheim actually has in mind when he says that there are modes of thought which cannot be adequately understood so long as their social origins are obscured. Mannheim now elaborates on this idea in the way that I would if I had his skill. He says, strictly speaking, it is incorrect to say that the single individual thinks. Rather, it is more correct to insist that he participates in thinking further what other men have thought before him. He finds himself in an inherited situation with patterns of thought which are appropriate to this situation and attempts to elaborate further the inherited modes of response or to substitute others for them in order to deal more adequately with the new challenges which have arisen out of the shifts and changes in his situation. Every individual is therefore in a twofold sense predetermined by the fact of growing up in a society. On the one hand, he finds a ready-made situation, and on the other, he finds in that situation preformed patterns of thought and of conduct. A few pages later, Mannheim asks plaintively, how is it possible that identical human thought processes concerned with the same world produce divergent conceptions of that world? Now that may sound to us like a truism. Listen to it again. How is it possible that identical human thought processes concerned with the same world produce divergent conceptions of that world? These days we are all familiar with the notion of the epistemic bubble. with people whose politics are such that they talk only to those who agree with them. They accept only facts or quasi-facts that support their point of view. They refuse to believe simple facts like global warming or economic trends or even the statistics of voting and polling if they don't confirm their pre-established beliefs. And since they talk to nobody but themselves, their views are never challenged. They live in totally separate worlds. They go through identical human thought processes. They are concerned with the same world, but they produce divergent conceptions of that world. But to Mannheim, writing in the 1920s, this new phenomenon seemed to him a devastating attack and undermining of the intellectual traditions that he thought were the heart and soul of Western civilization. And they were enormously upsetting to him. And indeed, this entire book is his attempt to do two things: to come to an understanding of how that happens, and, somewhat less successfully, alas, to find a way to work past that to a unified understanding of the world that will make it possible once again for people coming from very different points of view actually to carry out organized and ordinary conversations with one another about the same world. Mannheim now enunciates a second thesis. And this second thesis is really the core of what is upsetting him. He says, political discussion possesses a character fundamentally different from academic discussion. It seeks not only to be in the right, but also to demolish the basis of its opponent's social and intellectual existence. Political conflict, since it is from the very beginning a rationalized form of the struggle for social predominance, attacks the social status of the opponent, his public prestige, and his self-confidence. Physical repression is, it is true, harder to bear externally, but the will to psychic annihilation is perhaps even more unbearable. And he goes on that the tearing away of the facade of reasonableness and the revealing of the social situational roots of thought takes the form of an unmasking. This is the central idea of Mannheim's book, and it is the central idea of ideological critique. So I want to take just a little while to talk about that. Think about academic discussions. They can be very vigorous. They can be very angry. You can get academic debates in which individuals argue very vigorously and even violently in support of their point of view, whether it is in physics or chemistry or economics or even, Lord help us, philosophy. But there are certain presuppositions which underlie these debates. The first supposition is that all of the participants are members of the same world, the same academy. They have the same credentials, PhDs, let us suppose. They abide by the same notions of evidence and argument. If they produce an argument which says, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal, it will be pointed out to them that they have made a logical error, and they will say, oh, you're correct, I have made a logical error. I am sorry, I must find a different argument if I really want to defend the view that Socrates is immortal. If they add 2 and 2, they don't get 5 because 5 is what they want. They get 4 whether they want 5 or 4 or 3 because 4 is what 2 and 2 adds up to. And everyone recognizes that. And in more complex ways, they acknowledge the legitimacy of those with whom they are disagreeing, and therefore they acknowledge that they must meet certain criteria of evidence, of argument, and indeed even of decent behavior in these disagreements. Now, sometimes those principles are violated. Sometimes you find plagiarists, or you find scientists who report phony results because they so much want to demonstrate the truth of their claims. But when that happens, the individual is driven out of the academy. The individual is denied his status or her status in the academy, because those things violate the fundamental understandings of the academy. You don't attempt to destroy your opponent's very existence. You don't attempt to ridicule him, to expose him, to shame him, to drive him from the field. You attempt simply to show that your position is correct and your opponent's position is incorrect. Something analogous to that happens in parliamentary debates, in representative assemblies. In a representative assembly, the individuals are understood not to be speaking for themselves, but to be speaking on behalf of their constituents. And it is recognized that their constituents have different and conflicting interests. So it is assumed that they will disagree, not merely because they think the facts are different, but because they have different and competing interests, and that's acceptable. And when they talk to one another, it is understood that that is a way in which their constituents, in effect, are talking with one another. So let us say that Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican majority leader, is talking to Chuck Schumer, who, God willing, if the Democrats retake the Senate, will be the Senate Democratic, the majority leader for the Democrats. When Mitch McConnell talks to Chuck Schumer, it is in effect the people of Kentucky who are talking to the people of New York. They have different and competing interests. So Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer recognize that they may have to compromise with one another. Compromise is different from coming to agreement in an academic debate, but it is at the same time a way of recognizing the authenticity and legitimacy of the person with whom you are making the compromise. You're all familiar with the fact that Ted Cruz is universally hated by everybody in the Senate. He's hated not simply because he's a despicable human being. There are lots of despicable human beings in the United States Senate, but because he violates the norms of the Senate. He stands up on the floor of the Senate and says that Mitch McConnell has lied, and that is not something that one does in the Senate. And it is for that reason that he is ostracized and excluded from the Senate. It is for that reason that even his colleagues on the Republican side detest him and refuse to cooperate with him. Well, in ideological critique, Mannheim points out, what happens is that one attempts not simply to refute one's opponent, one attempts to destroy one's opponent as a human being, to demonstrate that one's opponent is beneath contempt, is unworthy to be part of the public discourse. And that, Mannheim suggests, when it first started to happen, was experienced by those who were the targets of it as a devastating experience, more devastating even than being physically attacked, as when in the 19th century one senator took out his cane in the United States Senate and beat another senator with it. That was not a nice thing to do, but it was, Mannheim thinks it would be even worse to unmask this person. Well, what form does this unmasking take? Well, it takes the form of showing or of claiming that the individual who is ostensibly presenting rational arguments is in fact covertly presenting distorted arguments and false claims in the service of some concealed interest, some powerful interest that the individual does not acknowledge and denies having any connection with. That this person is, to use one of my favorite phrases from the good old days, a running dog of imperialism, for example, that it was, or a lackey of the ruling classes. That is to say, somebody who simply is not engaged in genuine rational discourse. That is what ideological critique is. And we will see that that is, in a way, what Edwin Wilmson is doing in arguing against Richard Lee. It is what Henry Louis Gates is doing in arguing against literary critics at Yale. And it is, in an odd way, what Ed Said is doing in his discussion of Jane Austen, even though in Said's case, he's also a lover of the novels of Jane Austen. So he doesn't actually want to destroy her. He simply wants to reveal dimensions of what's going on in the English novel that the novelists themselves may not have been aware of. Although, as I say, I will show you at the very end of this series of lectures that Jane Austen was aware of what was going on, which is kind of a nice fact. Well, Mannheim now develops this argument, and I want to read to you several passages in which he develops this argument. First, once again, from this opening chapter, Mannheim says, "The concept ideology reflects the one discovery which emerged from political conflict, namely, that ruling groups can, in their thinking, become so intensively interest-bound to a situation that they are simply no longer able to see certain facts which would undermine their sense of domination. There is implicit in the word ideology the insight that in certain situations, the collective unconscious of certain groups obscures the real condition of society both to itself and to others, and thereby stabilizes it." Those last three words are crucial. Thereby stabilizes it. What Mannheim is saying is that these interest-bound distortions of reality serve a function. The function they serve is to stabilize and justify the existing order, and in that way to block change that might threaten that existing order. He goes on a little bit later. "At first, those parties which possessed the new intellectual weapons, the unmasking of the unconscious, had a terrific advantage over their adversaries. It was stupefying for the latter when it was demonstrated that their ideas were merely distorted reflections of their situation in life, anticipations of their unconscious interests. The mere fact that it could be convincingly demonstrated to the adversary that motives which had hitherto been hidden from him were at work must have filled him with terror and awakened in the person using the weapon a feeling of marvelous superiority." Sound familiar? This is a little bit like what people who've studied a little Freud think that they've gained when they go around explaining people's supposedly unconscious motivations. It was at the same time the dawning of a level of consciousness which mankind had hitherto always hidden from itself with the greatest tenacity. Nor was it by chance that this invasion of the unconscious was dared only by the attacker, while the attacked was doubly overwhelmed. First, through the laying bare of the unconscious itself, and then in addition to this, through the fact that the unconscious was laid bare and pushed into prominence in a spirit of enmity. For it is clear that it makes a considerable difference whether the unconscious is dealt with for purposes of aiding and curing or for the purpose of unmasking. In effect, what he is saying here is, it's one thing if you go to an analyst in order to get some clarity about your problems. It's another thing if an adversary in a public debate reveals you to be in the grip of unconscious and interested biases which you don't even acknowledge to yourself. Later on, we will see that, by the way, as Mannheim himself says, that once this happens, those who are attacked very quickly learn to return the attack in much the same spirit. But that will be in our next lecture. Well, what would be an example of this? All of this is rather general. Now, I would like to give an example, and as an example, I will give what is, after all, the classic example. The best example, and one of the first, namely Karl Marx's critique of the economists who were his predecessors and contemporaries. Some of you may know that Karl Marx's greatest work, Capital, which in all of its many volumes runs to almost 5,000 pages, has a subtitle, Critique of Political Economy. The subtitle is not Critique of Capitalism. The subtitle is Critique of Political Economy. Marx conceived of his book as a critique and an unmasking of his predecessors in the classical political economy tradition, a tradition that goes back to the physiocrats in France, the two most famous figures in that tradition being Adam Smith and David Ricardo, but there were many, many others. Marx, by the way, had great respect for Smith and Ricardo. It was the others whom he called vulgar economists, and he had a good deal of fun in Capital exposing their inadequacies. But Marx's central thesis is that in two fundamentally important ways, classical political economy systematically misrepresents the nature of capitalism and does so in order to defend capitalism against the threat of a socialist revolution, to put it as simply as I can. What are these two ways? The first way in which, according to Marx, classical political economy misrepresents capitalism is by presenting capitalism as nothing more nor less than the completion of the development of rationality in the economic world. Previous forms, feudalism, slavery, and so forth, are represented by them as merely inadequately rational forms of economic activity. And with capitalism, economic activity comes to full rationality in the marketplace, in the free market, and therefore there's no further system to develop. Capitalism is the fully developed economic system. And that misrepresentation, Marx thinks, defends capitalism against the threat of being consigned, in Engels' famous phrase, to the dustbin of history. It protects capitalism from the possibility of being overthrown by a socialist revolution. The second way in which capitalism misrepresents the reality of itself, in which the political economists misrepresent the reality of capitalism, is by portraying capitalism as the exchange of equals for equals in a free and open space where nobody is forced to make any bargain that he or she doesn't want to make, and where all the bargains are equal exchanges. And this, Marx thinks, is fundamentally false. He thinks he can demonstrate mathematically, and indeed does demonstrate mathematically, in my judgment, that capitalism rests on the exploitation of the working class. It is not an equal system at all. Let me just read you one of the greatest passages in which Marx enunciates this view. This is from Capital. I'm reading from the very end of chapter 6. Marx says, "This sphere that we are deserting, the sphere of the marketplace, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man." He's writing here, of course, in a mocking, ironic tone. "There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained only by their own free will. They contract as free agents, and the agreement they come to is but the form in which they give legal expression to their common will. Equality, because each enters into relation with the other as with a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalence for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own, and Bentham, because each looks only to himself. The only force that brings them together and puts them in relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interests of each. Each looks to himself alone, and no one troubles himself about the rest, and just because they do so, they all, in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an all-shrewd providence, work together to their mutual advantage for the common weal and in the interest of all." That's Marx's marvelous characterization of the view put forward by the classical political economists. And I will point out to you that that very same view can be found tricked out with a lot of very fancy mathematics in modern 21st century economic theory. For all the advances that economics has supposedly made, for the introduction of marginal utility, for the introduction of the calculus, for the marvelous saving presence of Lord Keynes, and all the rest of it, all the theories of general equilibrium, it's the same story. And in the same way, it is a story that is designed to protect capitalism against the possibility of change. All ideologies, Mannheim thinks, have this character. That is to say, they have this character that they systematically distort and misrepresent reality in the interest of protecting the power and the wealth and the control of those who are in control in the society, those who are the dominant force in the society. Now, why does Mannheim call his book Ideology and Utopia? Because he thinks there's another kind of systematic distortion that takes place, which is the obverse of this. And that is a systematic distortion or misrepresentation of reality whose purpose it is to exaggerate the possibility of change and to make it seem more likely that the ruling powers will be overthrown and that some group now held down will rise up and take control. So there are these two kinds of systematic misrepresentations, ideologies on the one hand and utopias on the other hand. I think I'm going to stop here because next week, when I continue these lectures, we will see the way in which Mannheim develops this view, gives us more concrete pictures of ideologies and utopias, and then undertakes something quite extraordinary, which is an ideological interpretation of our consciousness of time itself. That is, to my way of thinking, the intellectual high point of the entire book, and I'll spend some time talking about it. But at any rate, let me remind you, if you wish to get more information about these lectures as they go forward, you can go to my blog, The Philosopher's Stone, which you can find by Googling me. And there you will find some information, a list of the books that I mentioned briefly at the beginning of these remarks, and some idea of how I'm going to proceed. Thank you.